Okay, I think we'll probably go ahead and get started. We are recording this. So if you do have to jump off and tend to your county business, you can watch the recording on our education catalog. So today we are here to talk about cash reserves. We often field a lot of questions here at the NACO office regarding cash reserves, especially as the conversation of inheritance tax has been ongoing here at the Capitol for the last couple of years. So we have Jeff Schreier from the auditor's office with us today to visit with us more about that. So thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it. Take it away.
Can you see my screen and everything, Candace? Does that sound
Yes.
good?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, I guess we'll get started here. Like Candace said, we'll talk about cash reserves a little bit. Like Candace mentioned, I think especially now with all the discussion the last couple of years over inheritance taxes, I think there's no guarantee that that's going to be around forever is kind of my take on it. Maybe hope for the best, but prepare for the worst with that topic. So hopefully have some good information for everybody today on cash reserves and why they're really important for the budget process, and also just kind of the overall financial management of the county, make sure the county is financially sound. So with that, just kind of the agenda for today. What are cash reserves? Why are they so important? Why are we talking about them today? How to go about establishing those cash reserves, answering the question of, are my cash reserves adequate? Talking a little bit about the cash reserve and the tax collection timeline, make sure everybody understands that process, and then some of the limits the statutes put on cash reserves. So cash reserves, what are they? I think it's pretty simple. It's basically money that's in the bank that the county hasn't spent yet. I kind of equate things to my personal finances. Really, the county's no different. The balance in my bank account is my money, my cash reserve. Same idea applies to the county. Whatever the money is in the bank in your fund balances, those are your cash reserves. So typically with counties, our cash reserve is primarily our general fund balance and our inheritance fund balance. Those are kind of our main two sources, at least currently, of cash reserves. So some of you, depending on the counties and how you guys have set things up over the years, you might have additional other funds. You may have established sinking funds or those kind of items, or set aside funds. So maybe you might have some other cash reserve funds already besides just your general or inheritance. But typically those are going to be your two main sources of your cash reserves for your county. You guys obviously realize that you have a lot of other funds besides just your general fund and your inheritance tax fund. But the thing to remember with those other funds, your road fund, preservation and modernization, visitor promotion, all those other funds that the county uses, those other funds are typically set up and designated for a specific purpose. So they're not necessarily available for general expenditures of the county. So your road fund, obviously that's set up for road purposes. Your preservation modernization is for preservation of records. Bond funds, we're levying taxes specifically to pay off those bonds. And then other funds that may be restricted. Visitor promotion, well, that's for visitor promotion. So really those other funds, if something comes up and we need money for just general operations of the county, we really can't tap into those other funds the county has because they're for a specific purpose. So if we're running low on money in our general fund, it's not like we can really transfer money from our bond fund because that bond fund is for paying off our bonds. It's not just for the general operations of our county. Same idea would apply to any of those other funds. So that's a key thing to remember is generally speaking, all of those other funds the county uses, they're designated for those specific purposes and only available for those purposes. So as a result of that, because they're kind of earmarked for that specific purpose, I would not include them when you're looking at your cash reserves. I would not include those other funds because they're earmarked and they're not available for just general operations of the county. Now, with that being said, if you're looking at what are our reserves for roads, well, then obviously you could consider what your road fund balance is, from that standpoint. Or if you're looking at, do we have enough money to pay off our bonds? Well, then yeah, you'd be looking at what your bond fund balance is. But if we're just looking at what are our cash reserves available for just general costs, general operations of our county, you want to make sure you're considering whether or not those other funds are earmarked for a specific purpose and not available for that, whatever purpose you're looking at. Why are they important? Cash reserves are important basically because they help you get through low tax collection times. First of all, they help you when unexpected costs come up, and they help you if you need to make large one-time purchases. So like I mentioned, I kind of equate cash reserves to my personal finances. It's a good idea to have emergency fund if the water heater goes out in your house. Well, same idea applies to the county. We need to have cash reserves for those low tax collection times to help us get through those low tax collection months. But we also want to make sure we have those reserves available when unexpected costs come up. If we need to, replace the HVAC system in the courthouse unexpectedly, or we have, the motor grader transmission goes out and we have costs for that. Basically, we need to make sure we have reserves for those unexpected items. Mentioned already, inheritance fund is primary source of cash reserves, at least currently, but I think all the counties need to be asking themselves and coming up with a plan in case the inheritance tax is eliminated and you no longer can transfer money from inheritance. If the current answer to that question, when our general fund balance is low or we need money in our road fund, if the answer to that question currently is always transfer money from inheritance, I think everybody should be thinking about what do we do if that's no longer an option, if we don't have that inheritance tax money anymore. Hopefully so far, at least we've been successful in keeping that inheritance tax money available. It's been reduced a little bit the last couple of years, but at least it's still available. So hopefully, like I said earlier, plan for the worst, but hope for the best. But again, I really think the counties need to be looking at other ways to build up your cash reserve balances. Few more information here on why they are important. We have to remember that we can't pay claims out of a fund if we don't have we don't have enough money in that fund to pay claims. So another way to say that is we cannot have negative fund balances. So if we have $100,000 in our general fund and our claims this month are $150,000, that's a problem. We can't pay those $150,000 of claims from our general fund because we don't have enough money in there. So according to the statute here, 77-2203 says that we would need to register those warrants until sufficient money is available in the fund to pay. So that registering warrant process is maybe a little bit outdated and not used too much anymore. But basically, if the claims come in for 150,000, we don't have 150,000 in the fund. We either need to find a way to get more money in that fund, or we can't pay claims. So that's another reason to make sure we have adequate cash reserves so we can, basically pay our bills as they come due. So what happens if we don't have enough money in the fund to pay claims and the county doesn't want to register warrants? Well, a few options: transfer money from another unrestricted fund, so inheritance fund. If it's a fund that doesn't have enough money that's not the general fund, we could transfer from the general fund, but basically transfer money into that fund so we do have enough money to pay the claims that were approved. The other option is we do register the warrant and we just don't pay for it. But what happens if it's payroll? I would imagine that the employees at the county aren't going to be too happy if they aren't getting their paychecks when they're supposed to. I would imagine same thing with the vendors. They're not going to be too happy if they aren't getting paid on time. So other option would be come up with some other way to finance the purchase. So looking at bonds, potentially issuing bonds. But the downside of that is there's going to be additional cost for issuing the bond. So that, is something to consider. And, if we did have adequate cash reserves in the first place, we wouldn't have to worry about issuing the bond. Could also look at lease purchase agreements. Instead of paying for the motor grader in one lump sum, maybe we do a lease purchase and spread those payments out over 5 or 10 years. That would be something else the county board could consider. There is authority in the statute to borrow money. So statute 23-160.01 does provide authority to the county board to borrow money, but there is specific requirements for that. So this slide just shows basically a quote from the statute, but I'll highlight a few things. The statute basically says that the county board can borrow money, but you can only borrow money in an amount sufficient to pay all valid legally existing warrants of the county. So another way to say that in maybe a little more plain English is that we can borrow money to pay claims that we have sitting out there. So in my example, if we have 150,000 in claims, but only 100,000 in our general fund, we could borrow money to pay that $50,000 that we're short. But we can't borrow 50,000 and just stick it in our general fund to have as a balance available. Because at that point, we aren't borrowing money to pay legally existing warrants. We're just borrowing money to stick it in our general fund. The other thing to keep in mind, if you do go down this borrowing money path, is that you have to have a negotiable promissory note issued in the name of the county, and that promissory note cannot run for more than 1 year. So basically, if we borrow money, if we borrow $50,000 in my example, we have to pay that back within a year. So that's an option out there that I thought I would mention. I don't know that I've seen this happen too much, at least in the last several years, but technically there would be an option out there to borrow money if it comes down to that. But I mean, the ideal situation is we plan ahead and we don't get to that point in the first place. How to establish cash reserves. I think it really starts during the annual budget process, which I think everybody's hopefully getting started on right now. And really, I think it's pretty simple. We basically adopt a budget that spends less money than we have available. So if we look at the little formula we have here, we all know what we're starting the year with. We know what our beginning fund balances are. We're going to budget receipts other than property taxes. We're going to come up with how much we need in property taxes to come up with our total resources available. Basically how much money we start the year with, plus how much money we're expecting to get during the year. If we subtract out how much we're budgeting to spend, that equals our cash reserve. So if we want to build up our cash reserve, we need to make that total resources available bigger than what we're budgeting to spend. So, I mean, I think it's pretty simple. Saying, basically just don't spend too much money, or figure out a way to get more money. So we need to increase, if we want to try to start increasing our cash reserve, our options are either make changes to the budget that increase the amount of money coming into the county, whether that's raising property taxes, or maybe we increase the fees that we charge to our customers, assuming that it's a fee that's not set by statute. Obviously, we can't increase the amount of marriage licenses because that's a statutory fee, but if we're charging fees for copies for 25 cents, and it's been 25 cents for the last 50 years, and the cost of those copies are now 30 cents, well, maybe we need to increase our fees. Potentially look at grants, looking at getting more grants to help cover the cost of the county. Or if we don't have a way to bring more money into the county, we're basically forced into reducing spending. So if we want to build up the amount of money we have in the bank, options are either get more money in there, find a way to bring more money into the county, or figure out where we're going to cut spending. You might also want to consider transferring unrestricted money to a sinking fund, so it's clearly set aside. We'll talk here and walk through an example here in a subsequent slide, but the problem with the budget is the budget's obviously a budget. So depending on what actually happens during the year, we might estimate that we're going to get X dollar amounts for a specific fee, but that's just a budget. The actual might come in lower. So even though we're adopting a budget that says our cash reserve is $1 million, if we don't get as much money in as we originally expected to, that $1 million cash reserve might come in significantly less. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail here in a little bit, but that's kind of the problem with the budget, is depending on what the actual numbers end up with, you might not have as much cash reserve at the end of the year as you might expect. So the solution to that is to actually transfer money to a sinking fund or some other set aside fund. So that way, you know, we have a sinking fund set up and we have 500,000 in that sinking fund. We know that that 500,000 is set aside. So that could be something that you look at doing. If you want to set up a sinking fund or a set aside fund, you'd want to look at the code manual on our website to look at what fund numbers are available for you to use for those purposes. But the benefit of that is if you transfer that money from the general fund or wherever, it's clearly set aside for that purpose. So example here to kind of go into more detail of what I just talked about. I think in the budget process, I talked to quite a few people throughout the year, you know, as not just counties, but all the different local governments as they're adopting their budget. A lot of those conversations focus on how much we're budgeting to spend, but I really don't hear much from the governing boards that I talk to of them saying, I'm really, you know, not only am I looking at how much we're spending, but I'm also really making sure I'm doing a really good job estimating revenue besides property taxes. And I think that those budgeted numbers on the revenue side of the budget are just as important as the numbers we have on the disbursement side of the budget. So to kind of walk through an example here, let's say the county starts the year July 1st, 2023 with $100,000 in their general fund. Let's say they budget to receive $1 million in revenue besides property taxes. And then they also have $1 million property tax request. So we start the year with 100,000. We're expecting to bring in, or we're budgeting to bring in $2 million. And then we're also budgeting to spend $2 million. Well, if we start with 100,000, bring in 2 million, spend 2 million, at the end of the year, we're budgeting to end the year with $100,000. But let's fast forward a year to the end. Let's fast forward a year to June 30, 2024. And let's say the county ends up only receiving $500,000 in revenue besides property taxes. So when we did our budget, we expected to bring in $1 million, but we actually only ended up bringing $500,000. Well, all of a sudden that $100,000 budgeted cash reserve, if we all else staying the same, the county would actually be in the hole $400,000 because they did not bring in as much as they originally budgeted. So this table is basically just walking through that same process. So the left-hand column there is the budget. The right-hand column is the actual. So if everything else stays the same, but we did a less than ideal job of estimating that revenue other than property taxes, could lead to a big problem. Because I don't know about you, but a lot of people, the way the budget works is if they don't spend it, they lose it. So they make sure to spend their full budget every year. But the problem comes in of they might spend the whole thing, but if we didn't bring in enough money to cover what we budgeted, we, in this example, would be in the whole $400,000. So that's where I think it's really important to make sure you're doing a good job and really thinking about what other money are we going to have coming into the county besides property taxes, and trying really hard to get those numbers as accurate as possible. Let's flip the tables here a little bit. Instead of being short 500,000, let's say we originally anticipated to bring in $1 million besides property taxes, but we estimated it on the low side and we actually end up bringing in $1.5 million. Well, if we work through the little formula I have here, we originally budgeted a $100,000 cash reserve, but if we bring in an extra 500,000, that means we now actually end the year with 600,000. So that could be a good thing. If you're a county that you're trying to build up your cash reserves, that could be a good thing for you. You ended up better than you originally anticipated. But maybe your county is already doing a really good job with cash reserve. You have enough money in your general fund or in your other funds. Maybe you don't need to be building up your cash reserves. If that's the case, then basically you taxed more than you needed to. You could have lowered your levy and not tax the local taxpayers as much as you did. And the reason that you could have lowered the levy is because you got in other money besides property taxes. So depending on how you look at it on this scenario, it could be a good thing, or it could maybe not be as a good thing because we overtaxed. Are my cash reserves adequate? So I think that's the $1 million question, and I don't have the answer. I think every county is a little bit different. Every county has unique circumstances going on in your county, and I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to that question. But I think the people at the courthouse, the county board, the clerks, the treasurers, you guys are the ones that are going to be most knowledgeable about what's going on in your county, what your needs are, what your evaluation's doing. And I think you guys are going to be the ones to make that decision. I will say that some financial experts that are probably smarter than me recommend a 25% cash reserve. So another way to say that would be that if you, your cash reserve should be enough to cover 3 months worth of expenditures. So as an example here, let's say your county spends $4 million per year. If we multiply that by 25%, that would mean a 25% cash reserve would be $1 million. So like I said, I don't know that that's necessarily the right answer for every county. That's just maybe a starting point. And you might need to adjust that up and you might need to adjust that down, but at least maybe a starting point for you. I think another way to answer this question is look at the low tax collection months and see what your fund balances are. I mean, you guys know the months that bring in the most property taxes, and you know the months that don't bring in very much in property taxes at all. So if you look at those low tax collection months and your fund balances are getting too low for comfort, or if you're having to transfer money because you don't have enough money in a particular fund to pay claims, that's a sign that you're maybe running a little too low on your cash reserves. I also recommend that the county board get the fund balance reports from the treasurer every month. So that way the board knows where they're at. So that way the board knows how much money the county has available, because that's going to, dictate what they're going to spend money on. So if they get the fund balance report from the treasurer and it says we only have $200,000 in the road fund, well, then they're probably not going to be buying a motor grader this month. But if they aren't getting the fund balance reports and they don't have any clue what money they have or what money they don't have, you could buy a motor grader and now all of a sudden we don't have enough money to pay our road guys. So I think it's really important that we're involving the board. The treasurer is providing those fund balance reports to the board. The clerk's providing the budget reports, budget comparison reports to show where we're at, actual versus budget. So that way they can consider that when claims come in for approval, that they have that information available to them. Cash reserve timeline. I wanted to touch on this just because it's kind of a little bit unique, that the timing that we're working with in the county budget process of when we adopt the budget for the fiscal year, when the taxes for that budget start coming in. So obviously county's fiscal year starts July 1st. We go all the way to September 30th before we adopt the budget for that year. So basically a quarter of the year is already gone before we have the budget adopted for that year. We go all the way to May 1st. If anybody from Douglas, Lancaster, or Sarpy is here, move that up a month. But for everybody else, first half of taxes are delinquent May 1st. So majority of people, I would say, are paying their first half in April, and then they're going to pay their second half in August, right before that September 1st delinquent date for the second half. So you can see we adopt a budget that starts July 1st, quarter goes by before we even have a budget for that year. And the property taxes that we're levying to fund that budget, it's all going to be, almost the whole year is going to be over before we start collecting those taxes that were levied to fund that year's budget. So depending on the timing and depending on what your property tax does from year to year, if your property tax request stays pretty consistent from year to year, then it's probably not going to be a big problem. But if you are significantly increasing your property tax request to fund this year's budget and the disbursements that you put in this year's budget, and you're going to pay for those items by increasing your property taxes, you could run into cash reserve problems, because the authority to spend the money is there right away. The budget authority is there right away once the budget's adopted, but that doesn't mean we've actually brought in enough money to cover those costs. So depending on what we start the year with, depending on the timing of everything, could cause issues with that. So not only do we have to make sure we're monitoring the budget to make sure we have the budget authority to spend the money, but we also have to make sure we actually have the money in the bank to spend the money. So same thing I just said, the budget does not equal money in the bank. The budget is just the budget. The budget is our authority to spend the money. But like we talked about earlier, the statutes don't let us spend more money than we have. So we have to kind of do a double-edged sword here of make sure we're monitoring our budget authority, and we're looking at what the treasurer's fund balances are to see how much money we actually have in the bank. So like I said, just another way to say that, budget might say we can spend the money, but we have to make sure we have the money in the fund before we can actually spend it. Cash reserve limits. Counties are subject to both the Nebraska Budget Act in Chapter 13, Article 5, and the County Budget Act in Chapter 23, Article 9. So you guys, I always mention when I talk to counties that you guys are special and that you have two sets of budget statutes to follow versus everybody else just has one. But both the Nebraska Budget Act and the County Budget Act have limits on the cash reserves that we can have. So to start off with here, the Nebraska Budget Act in 13503 says, first of all, it defines cash reserves as funds that are required for the period before revenue would become available for expenditure. But the key thing, shall not include funds held in any special reserve fund. Okay, well, now the question is, what is a special reserve fund? Well, statutes have a definition of special reserve fund, and the definition is any special fund set aside by the governing body for a particular purpose and not available for expenditure for any other purpose. So basically, if we have a fund set up for a specific purpose, I would say the road fund, for example, would fit the definition of a special reserve fund. We set up the road fund for a particular purpose and it's only available for roads. So on the Nebraska Budget Act side, we can exclude the balance of those special reserve funds from our overall cash reserve percentage that we're limited to. So 13504 would then say that each governing body has to adopt a budget on forms prescribed by the auditor, and that proposed budget statement has to contain the following information. And one of the pieces of information that those budget forms have to include is the amount of the cash reserve. And you can see that underlying portion, it says that the cash reserve shall not exceed 50% of the total budget adopted, exclusive of capital outlay items. So we can exclude money that we have in a special reserve fund, and we also can exclude capital outlay items in this calculation. But otherwise, we're limited to 50%. So if we're budgeting to spend, total expenditures of the county are $1 million, well, 50% of that would be 500,000. So basically 50% of our budgeted disbursements would be what the Nebraska Budget Act says the limit is. The County Budget Act is a little bit different. Statute 23910 in the County Budget Act says that the operating reserve shall not be more than 50% of the total expenditures for the fund during the last completed fiscal year. So on the County Budget Act side, we still have that 50%, but that 50% is applied to these total expenditures of each individual fund during the last completed fiscal year. So on the Nebraska budget side, it's based on our budgeted disbursements for the upcoming year. In the County Budget Act side, that 50% is applied to actual expenditures in each fund for the last year. So it's a little bit different. I will say that typically our office during our budget review process has not maybe made too big of a deal about this, because typically we don't see too many counties having excessive cash reserves. So, you know, just because we don't say anything about it during our cash reserve doesn't mean that it's not a problem. Basically, at least in the past, we haven't made this a priority to spend time on during our budget review. So just something to keep in mind there. Like I said, I really don't think these limits should come into play too much, because counties typically aren't holding too much money that they're not spending. But I at least wanted to mention that there are a couple limits out there related to the cash reserves. I think that is all I had for my slides. I don't know if we can do questions, but I'd be happy to answer questions if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, let me see if the chat is open here real quick. Okay, the chat is open. If anybody has any questions, or if you if you have a mic and want to talk or ask a question, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. No questions?
Would preservation and modernization or a special road fund be an example of a sinking fund? I would say no. I would say that would not be example of a sinking fund, because those preservation and modernization fund and the special road fund would be a set up for a specific purpose. So, you know, because it's specifically for preservation or specifically for roads, I would say that's not a sinking fund. A sinking fund would typically be, we're just transferring money from like our general fund to a set aside fund. And there's really no restrictions on it. We just wanted to basically set it aside. Will the slideshow be sent out? Yes, we can send out the slideshow. Yep, we can send out the slideshow. Looks like that's the other questions. Yep, I can maybe share it with Candace, and Candace can send it out to everybody.
Yeah, well, we can upload it in the learning management system as well. And then we'll also have that we have recorded this, so we will have the recording available.
Looks like we have a question. What do we need to build the sinking fund into the budget? Can the sinking fund be added to the levy? So the first part, what do we need to add the sinking fund to the budget? Yes, we would need to add the sinking fund to the budget. Basically, if you wanted to establish a sinking fund when you're doing the upcoming budget, you would want to, I would say, budget to transfer money from the general fund or somewhere else to that sinking fund. So you would want to make sure that's part of your budget, so you could do that transfer. And then, can the sinking fund be added to the levy? Maybe. The question there would be, is there a statute out there that would give you authority to have a levy specifically for that purpose? So if you can come up with a statute that says we can have a levy for a courthouse sinking fund, then you could have a levy specifically for the courthouse sinking fund. Otherwise, I would say you would basically just want to build it into your general fund levy and budget for the transfer out to the sinking fund. Should we have cash reserves in other funds besides general fund and insurance fund, say in the road fund or weed fund? I would say yes. I will say that I myself, at least the last few years, have reviewed all 93 county budgets. And I also do approximately 10 to 12 county audits. And then I'm involved a little bit in the other 20 or so county audits we do. And I normally see that nobody is budgeting for a cash reserve in any fund besides the general, maybe the inheritance, maybe an insurance fund, but all those other miscellaneous road fund, weed fund, all those other funds, pretty much everyone is budgeting to spend all the money they have available. And I'm assuming they're doing that so that way they don't have to worry about doing a budget amendment. And I suppose that makes sense. It's probably not as big of a deal in those other funds, but I mean, I don't think it would hurt to have a cash reserve in there. But I also see the benefit of not having it, budgeting to spend everything, and then that way you don't have to worry about doing a budget amendment. So I would say the road fund, I would say a cash reserve in the road fund. I would say a cash reserve in insurance fund, weed fund. I guess my thought on the weed fund would be, do you even need a weed fund in the first place? Or could you just basically have a budget in the general fund for weeds? I think in the past, a lot of people had weed funds. I think the statutes used to require a separate weed fund, but they don't anymore. So for weed specifically, I would start or would consider not having a separate fund at all and just do it through your general fund and have a separate weed budget in the general fund.
I don't know if you caught that one. What would qualify for a specific set aside fund? Did you catch that question?
Nope. What would qualify for a specific set aside fund? I think as far as like the cash reserve, special reserve fund in the Nebraska Budget Act, That's pretty open-ended as far as that special reserve fund. I'm not sure if that's what we were talking about there. That's pretty open-ended. As long as it's set aside for a specific purpose and not available for anything else, that would meet the definition of the special reserve fund. Set aside fund, you know, I'll say, use the term set aside fund as basically just we're setting up a separate fund outside of the general fund or anything else, where we are putting that money aside. The county board would need to approve setting up that fund, that separate sinking fund or set aside fund or whatever you want to call it. And really the county board should be identifying what that fund is to be used for. So if it's a set aside fund for roads and we only want to use it for roads, well, when the county board approves establishing that fund in that resolution, they should be saying it's for roads. The other thing to keep in mind is technically we want to make sure we have authority in the statutes to do anything. So if we're setting up a separate fund, probably would be a good idea to work with the county attorney's office and make sure they're okay with doing that and establishing that fund and putting money aside in there. But otherwise, I would say really it would be kind of up to the county board. You know, first of all, if they want to set up the separate fund in the first place, and then if they do, what the money in that fund could be used for. Is it just general county-wide, or is it specific for roads? Is it specific for the courthouse renovations, or whatever the case is? I think that would be ultimately up to the county board.
Okay, I don't see any more questions and I don't believe anybody raised their hand. So I think we're done there. So thank you so much, Jeff, for the information. It was very helpful. So
Good. Yep. And
much
if anybody
appreciation.
has any questions, you can always give me a call or send me an email too. I'm always available. So,
All right. All right. Well, everybody have a great rest of your day.
all right. Thank you, guys.
Bye.